At 2 a.m. on a warm July night in 64 AD, Rome, home to 1,000,000 souls, was more vulnerable than anyone dared admit. 45,000 wooden apartment blocks packed 3 meters apart, oil lamps flickering in cramped alleys, and not a single organized fire brigade. When a single blaze ignited near the Circus Maximus, winds turned it into history's most infamous Inferno. The fire that almost ended Rome wasn't just a tragedy, it was a catastrophe nobody thought possible. But how did a city so mighty come so close to destruction? And what happened to those trapped inside its walls? Dense, restless, and always on edge, Rome in 64 AD was a city built for disaster. Every day, nearly 1,000,000 people squeezed into neighborhoods where space was so scarce that builders piled new floors atop old ones, reaching 6, 7, sometimes even 9 stories high. These insulae, Rome's signature apartment blocks, rose from stone ground floors but relied almost entirely on timber for upper walls, floors, and roofs. Mud bricks and plaster filled the gaps, but wood was the skeleton holding the city together. In some districts, especially the Suburra and Transtiberum, as much as 70% of the housing stock was timber framed. The poorest residents crowded into these upper stories where the walls were thin, the stairways narrow, and the exits few. The city's streets were little more than cracks between buildings. In the slums, alleys could shrink to 3 meters wide or less, twisting unpredictably and ending in dead ends that choked off air and light. Even in wealthier areas, the average street was just 4 to 6 meters across. This urban maze trapped heat in the summer and made it almost impossible for carts, let alone water carriers or fire patrols, to pass through in an emergency. Open flames were everywhere. Most families cooked over small fires in their rooms or on shared landings. Oil lamps, cheap and plentiful, burned at every doorway and window well into the night. Shops and taverns on the ground floor doubled as workshops, with kilns, forges, and ovens running hot beside piles of timber, straw, and cloth. Sparks drifted constantly. In dry summers, the city's mud brick and timber dried out, becoming as flammable as kindling. Waste piled up in alleys, adding to the risk. Fires weren't rare, they were routine. Tacitus and Juvenal both described blazes that swept through insulae, leaping from roof to roof in minutes. Yet Rome had no professional fire brigade. The vigils, a night watch established by Augustus, patrolled with buckets and axes, but their numbers, about 11,000 for the entire city, were no match for the scale of the threat. Their tools could control a kitchen fire, but not a building engulfed in flames. Most residents knew that if a fire broke out, escape would be difficult, and help would arrive too late. This was the reality of daily life, a city packed so tightly and built so cheaply that disaster was not just possible, but inevitable. The Great Fire did not invent the danger, it simply revealed how fragile Rome really was. At 2 o'clock in the morning, a flicker of light broke out in a row of merchant stalls pressed against the southern wall of the Circus Maximus. Lucius Marcellus, a baker's apprentice finishing the night's loaves, would later recall the first shouts echoing through the narrow passageways. Shouts that were quickly swallowed by the roar of the wind. In the heat of a Roman July, the city's wooden bones had dried to tinder. Within minutes, flames leapt from one stall to the next, feeding on baskets of straw, oil jars, and piles of kindling stacked for morning ovens. A gust, stronger than any in weeks, whipped through the circus's open archways. Ancient accounts describe winds reaching 30 miles per hour, enough to hurl embers across the alleys and into the upper stories of nearby insulae. Sparks rained on rooftops and balconies, igniting curtains and timber beams. In the maze of the Suburra, Residents woke to a sky already glowing red, the air thick with smoke and the crack of splitting wood. Gaius Aelius, a member of the Vigilus, grabbed his bucket, 12 liters, heavy but pitifully small against the growing Inferno, and joined a line of men scrambling to form a bucket chain. Water sloshed onto the cobbles, lost in the scramble. The Vigils, trained for kitchen blazes and drunken brawls, found themselves powerless. Their axes splintered doors and their buckets passed from hand to hand, but the flames outpaced them at every turn. The wind drove fire through the city's arteries, twisting flames into the upper floors where families were trapped by collapsing stairs and blocked corridors. Any hope of containing the blaze vanished as walls buckled and roofs caved in. Panic spread faster than the fire. People clambered over each other in alleys too narrow for escape, dragging children and possessions through choking smoke. Some tried to stamp out embers with wet rags, others hurled buckets from windows, but the fire leapt street after street, fed by the city's own design. By sunrise, the fire had already carved a path north and east from the Circus Maximus, devouring shops, temples, and homes. The city's defenders, outnumbered and outmatched, watched as entire districts vanished behind curtains of smoke. In those first hours, Rome's greatest danger became reality. Not a single spark, but a storm of fire, carried by wind, unchecked and unstoppable. For 6 days and nights, the fire swept through Rome without mercy. 10 of the city's 14 districts lay in ruins by the time the flames finally died down. The destruction reached every corner, from the crowded slums of the Suburra to the grand houses edging the Palatine. Ancient temples that had stood for centuries, like the Temple of Jupiter Stator and the House of the Vestals, collapsed as roofs caved in and marble columns cracked in the heat. Charred remains of sacred sites littered the forum, their altars buried under ash. Smoke blotted out the sun, turning day into a strange gray twilight. Eyewitnesses described the air as thick and choking, filled with the stench of burning wood, oil, and flesh. Survivors stumbled through streets lined with blackened skeletons of buildings, calling out for lost family members. The city's famous markets and bustling forums vanished, replaced by fields of rubble and twisted iron. The fire's path could be traced in the scars left behind. Some districts, like the Caelian and Aventine, escaped with only smoke damage, but others, especially the Carine, the Velabrum, and the heart of the Palatine, were reduced to little more than piles of stone and ash. 2/3 of Rome was left in ruins. Every night the horizon glowed with the reflection of the flames, and even the most resilient Romans began to wonder if the city would ever recover. The scale of the disaster demanded a response no emperor could ignore. Rumors began to swirl before the embers had even cooled. Some whispered that Nero himself had ordered the fire, or that he sang of Troy's destruction while the city burned. Ancient writers like Suetonius and Cassius Dio repeated these stories, casting Nero as a villain who watched from a safe distance, lyre in hand. But the evidence tells a more complicated story. Tacitus, writing closer to the events, records that Nero was away at Antium when the fire broke out. He returned to Rome as the flames still raged, opening his own gardens and public buildings to shelter the homeless, arranging food shipments, and organizing relief camps. Yet, suspicion clung to the emperor. The devastation was so complete and the rebuilding so ambitious that many believed Nero had cleared the city to make way for his new palace, the Domus Aurea. Facing mounting anger, Nero looked for someone else to blame. He turned on the Christians, a small, unpopular sect in Rome. Arrests followed, executions became public spectacle. Some were burned alive to light the night, others torn apart by animals in the arena. Tacitus describes these punishments as so brutal that even Romans, accustomed to violence, felt pity for the victims. Meanwhile, Nero issued sweeping new building regulations. Streets were widened, building heights capped, and stone or brick became mandatory for new construction. Wooden facades were banned. These reforms aimed to prevent another catastrophe but came at a staggering cost. The treasury was strained, taxes rose, and property was seized to fund the reconstruction. The city's shape changed forever, but Nero's reputation never recovered. The fire and the emperor's response left scars that ran deeper than any ruin. Every city carries hidden vulnerabilities until disaster exposes them. Today, over half the world lives in sprawling, dense urban centers. As climate risks and infrastructure strains grow, Rome's lesson endures. Neglecting safety and planning turns small sparks into catastrophe. The cost is never just bricks, but lives and trust.